The vote counter updated at 0914 Standard Galactic Time, and I did not even flinch. Amber. Again. I had been sitting in the same chair for 6 weeks. The same curved seat in Gallery 7 of the Conclave of Urasath, the greatest diplomatic station ever built by any civilization in this corner of the galaxy. The ceiling above me was a dome of translucent alloy through which you could see the slow rotation of 2 moons and the distant smear of the nebula that the Veltarathi called the Wound of Creation. It was beautiful. I had stopped looking at it somewhere around week 3. My name is Sarah Miles. I am, or I was, the senior human ambassador to the Galactic Council. I had held that title for 11 years. In those 11 years, I had submitted 47 formal proposals, attended over 300 council sessions, and learned to speak 4 alien languages well enough that native speakers sometimes forgot I was human. I had done everything right. Every single thing. And the vote counter still glowed amber every single time. Amber meant abstained by default. It meant that humanity's proposal had not been read aloud in session. It had been received, logged, tagged with a procedural reference number, and placed in a review queue that moved at the speed of something that had long since stopped caring. The Council's rules were very clear. A proposal from a probationary observer species could only be elevated to active debate if a steering member seconded it. We had never once received a second in 40 years of membership. 40 years. My grandmother had been in the room when humanity was admitted to the Galactic Council. She had cried. She told me about it once, sitting in the kitchen of her house in Edinburgh, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes somewhere far away. She said it felt like the world had finally been given permission to matter. She said she had believed, truly believed, that everything would change. I thought about her a lot in Gallery 7. The proposal that was currently not being read was simple. It was, in fact, the simplest thing I had ever submitted on the 3rd moon of Kald 5. A human colony of approximately 212,000 people was dying. A respiratory pathogen had moved through the settlement in a matter of days. It was aggressive, fast, and not something human medical teams had the resources to treat alone. The cure existed. It sat in the Dominari Medical Archive, catalogued under Xenobiological Compound 1147, a treatment developed during an outbreak on a Dominari world 8 decades ago. We had asked for access. We had filed the request correctly. We had done everything the rulebook said to do. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. I want you to understand what 6 weeks means when people are struggling to breathe. I want you to understand what 6 weeks of council procedure looks like from a medical bay, where the air is thin and the staff is exhausted, and the messages home are getting shorter, because the people sending them do not have the energy to write more. In the first week, the Dominari delegate, a tall, slow-moving creature, called Ambassador Velthoth, had acknowledged receipt of our request and noted that cross-species medical data sharing was governed by the Urasath Accord of the previous century, which required review by the Health Commission, which met quarterly. In the second week, the Health Commission had convened a preliminary session and determined that Compound 1147 required reclassification from archival to active status before it could be shared. That reclassification needed 3 steering member signatures. In the third week, 2 of the 3 signatures had been gathered. The 3rd steering member, the Shari delegate, was traveling between systems and was unreachable, except by long-range message. The Council had a policy against binding votes conducted by message relay. It was in the founding charter. In the 4th week, the Shari delegate had returned. She had then requested 14 days to review the full medical file before signing, which was within her rights under Article 42 of the Procedural Guidelines. In the 5th week, I had stopped counting the dead and started just watching the number on a small screen. I kept on the table beside my water glass. 212,000 had become 194,000. I submitted an emergency override request. It was logged and tagged. In the 6th week, on a Tuesday morning by Earth reckoning, the number on my screen had reached 167,000. I sat in Gallery 7 and watched the vote counter glow amber, and I felt something change in my chest. Not break. I want to be precise about this. It did not break. It simply finished. There is a difference between a heart that is breaking and a heart that has finally finished waiting. The council moved on to the next item on the agenda. It was a scheduling discussion about the annual Stellar Cartography Conference. There was a genuine debate about the catering arrangements. A Velterathi delegate made a small joke, and two others laughed. The sound of it was like something from a place I no longer lived in. My communicator buzzed once. I looked down at it under the edge of the table, keeping my face still. The message was from Director Cole Hartley in Geneva. Director Hartley was not a man who sent messages during council sessions. He was not a man who sent messages at all. Usually, he preferred calls, because he said you could not read a person's voice in text. This message was text. It contained coordinates and a departure window. It told me that a full council vote had been held in the Human Parliament of Worlds 7 days ago, before I had been informed, and that the result had been unanimous. It told me that withdrawal proceedings had already begun at every human post across the conclave. It told me that my shuttle would be cleared for launch at 13 Standard Time, and that I should bring only what I could carry. It ended with 3 words. Come home, Sarah. I read it twice. Then I put the communicator away. Then I sat for another moment and looked around Gallery 7. The curved walls, the amber light of the vote counter, the dome above with its 2 moons and its beautiful wound of creation, the Velterathi delegates on their raised platform, calm and ancient and utterly unmoved by anything happening below them. I thought about my grandmother in Edinburgh and her mug of tea. Then I stood up. I did not slam my chair back. I did not say anything. Nobody looked up from their tablets and their procedural documents and their catering debate. I straightened the collar of my uniform, picked up my bag, and walked toward the exit at the back of Gallery 7. I was halfway to the door when Ambassador Velthoth glanced up. He looked at me, the way you look at someone who has stood up to use the bathroom during a meeting. Slightly inconvenient, already forgotten. I looked back at him for exactly 1 second. Then I walked out of a room that had never once listened. The corridor outside was long and white, and very quiet. My footsteps made a soft sound on the floor. I passed a human technician coming the other way, a young man named Peter Aldous, who maintained the water filtration systems in the residential tier. He looked at me and I looked at him, and something passed between us without any words. He nodded once. I nodded back. He kept walking. So did I. Outside the gallery windows, the 2 moons of Urasath turned slowly, as they always had, as they always would. The nebula drifted at the edge of sight, like a bruise the size of a star system. I did not look back. The first departure request came in at 0640, on a Wednesday. Ro had been on duty for 20 minutes when it landed on the docking manifest, and at first, it did not seem like anything at all. Cargo hauler, human registry, standard maintenance returned to the Cygnus relay station, origin dock, Bay 41, residential tier C. Departure window, 08 o'clock. Everything in order. Ro stamped it without looking up from the cup of mineral broth cooling beside the console. Ro was a Velterathi logistics officer, 3rd rank, assigned to docking authority on the conclave of Urasath for the past 12 years. Velterathi did not move around much once they found a post that suited them. Ro was good at the work, liked the quiet rhythm of manifests and berths and fuel allocation schedules, and had never given much thought to the species whose vessels passed through those numbers. Ships were ships. Numbers were numbers. The galaxy was full of both. By the end of that first Wednesday, Ro had processed 31 departure requests from human vessels. That was unusual. Not alarming. Just unusual. Ro noted it in the shift log, the way you might note a slight change in air pressure. Observable, not yet meaningful. The following week, the number was 63. Ro started paying closer attention. The vessels were varied. Cargo ships, personal transports, research vessels, 1 small medical frigate that had been docked at Bay 17 for almost 8 months while its crew worked contracts with the Council's Xenobiology Division. They all filed correct paperwork. Every single one. Departure manifests, cargo declarations, fuel receipts, forwarding addresses at human way stations outside the conclave's jurisdiction. Nothing missing, nothing irregular. They were, Ro would later reflect, the most perfectly filed set of departure documents ever processed through the docking authority in 12 years of service. What they did not file was any reason. The field on the form marked purpose of departure was filled, on every single one, with the same two words: internal restructuring. Rowe sent an inquiry to the Human Residential Administration Office on Tier C. The response came back within the hour, polite and precise. Thank you for your communication. Our administrative team is currently undergoing internal restructuring, and we will respond to all outstanding inquiries within standard processing cycles. We appreciate your patience. Rowe stared at that message for a long time. There was something in it that Rowe could not quite name. A Vel-Tarathi did not have the same instincts a human might have. The small hairs on the back of the neck standing up. The drop in the stomach that meant something was wrong. Vel-Tarathi felt things differently, in longer, slower waves, like weather moving through a large body of water. What Rowe felt that morning was a distant pressure. Not alarm, not yet, just the first suggestion of a change in the air. The weeks that followed were quiet, in the way that certain silences are quiet, the kind that are not empty but full of something you cannot see yet. The Human Trade Liaison Office on the commerce level closed. It was done cleanly and on schedule. The team cleared their space, returned the equipment, settled every outstanding contract, and left a forwarding contact for future correspondence with a firm registered at a human-operated relay 3 systems away. The commerce level noticed only because Bay 11 suddenly had open berth space again. The Vel-Tarathi delegates who used the trade office most often simply shifted their business to the Dominari liaison, which took 3 times as long and cost considerably more. Nobody on the council said anything about it. The human-operated translation service, which had been running out of a set of offices on the diplomatic corridor for almost 30 years, submitted its closure notice on a Friday afternoon. It gave 30 days. Rowe was not directly involved in that part of the conclave's operations, but the ripple reached the docking logs because the translation team's personal vessels began filing their own departure requests in the days that followed. 12 people, 12 ships, 12 correctly filled forms. Internal restructuring. Rowe had started keeping a separate file by this point. It was a personal habit, not an official duty. Rowe logged the numbers, the dates, the names of the vessels, the dock bays vacated, the services discontinued, not because anyone had asked, but because the Vel-Tarathi way of understanding change was to map it, to watch its shape from a distance before trying to name it. The shape was becoming clear. What Rowe had at first read as a series of individual, unconnected departures now looked, from a distance, like a tide going out. Slow, steady, and moving in one direction. The council did not notice for 3 full weeks. This, Rowe would later think, was perhaps the most important fact of the entire event. Not that humans left. Not how they left, but that the largest diplomatic body in the known galaxy, home to 41 species and 1,000 years of collective governance, took 21 days to notice that one of its member species had packed up and gone. When the council did notice, it was not because of the empty bays or the closed offices, or the silence from the residential tier that had once been full of noise and cooking smells, and the sound of a species that talked to itself constantly, in corridors, in lifts, over meals, as if the world needed to be narrated at all times to remain real. It noticed because the sanitation system in Wing D developed a fault, and the automated maintenance request went to a human technician whose communicator was no longer connected to the conclave network. The fault was minor. The system caught it and rerouted. But the failure to connect to the human maintenance coordinator triggered a cascade review, and the cascade review revealed that the entire maintenance scheduling database for Wing D, Wing E, and the lower atmospheric processors had been managed by a human team, and that team had been gone for 11 days. Ambassador Velthoth filed a formal inquiry. The response came from an automated relay service, registered to a human firm, based 3 systems away. Thank you for your communication. Our administrative team is currently undergoing internal restructuring, and we will respond to all outstanding inquiries within standard processing cycles. We appreciate your patience. Rowe read the council's internal report about this exchange sitting in the docking authority office at 02 o'clock in the station night. The corridors outside empty and dim. The report used words like unexpected and procedural gap and temporary disruption. It did not use the word departure. It did not use the word withdrawal. It certainly did not use the word consequence. Rowe pulled up the personal file. The numbers had grown considerably. Vessels departed from human registry, 417. Berths vacated, 61. Service contracts not renewed, 28. Human personnel no longer reachable via conclave network, approximately 2,300. Rowe sat with those numbers for a while. Then Rowe went looking at the infrastructure records, not because it was Rowe's job, but because the pressure had been building for weeks now, and Rowe needed to understand the shape of the thing. What Rowe found in those records took the rest of the night to process. The atmospheric processing systems that maintained breathable conditions throughout the conclave's residential tiers ran on a maintenance protocol last updated 18 months ago. The update had been submitted by a human engineer named Callum Brent. It was comprehensive, detailed, and covered every possible fault scenario. It was also scheduled to run automatically for the next 18 months without requiring any intervention. Callum Brent had left on one of the first departures, back in week 1. The water purification system across the lower residential levels was maintained through a system of scheduled chemical balancing that had been set up and automated by a human team 8 years prior. That automation was currently running on a schedule that would not need manual review for another 14 months. The data relay network that translated communications between 17 minor species and the rest of the Council had been built originally by a joint human-Vel-Tarathi team, but the human-developed translation layer at its core, the part that made the signals intelligible to species whose language structures did not map onto the standard galactic code, had been quietly maintained by 3 human linguists who rotated through the conclave on 2-year contracts. The last of the 3 had departed on a vessel called the Evening Ridge 9 days ago. Her replacement had not arrived because the contract renewal request had gone unanswered. The relay was still running. It was running on a cached translation matrix that those 3 linguists had spent years refining. It would keep running for some time, but it was running the way a lamp runs when you leave it on before going on a long trip. It works, until it does not. Rowe closed the records. Outside the docking authority windows, the conclave of Urasath turned slowly in the black. Its lights were on. Its systems were running. Everything looked, from the outside, exactly as it always had. Rowe thought of a phrase that humans used sometimes. Rowe had heard it from the maintenance techs who came in and out of the docking office over the years. A phrase they used when something appeared fine, but the problem had not yet become visible. The light from a dead star. You look up and you see it shining. You think everything is fine. But the star stopped burning 1,000 years ago, and the light you are seeing is old light, traveling still, because nothing had told it yet to stop. Rowe thought about the 2,300 human personnel who were no longer reachable. Rowe thought about Callum Brent and his 18-month maintenance protocol. Rowe thought about 3 linguists on a vessel called the Evening Ridge. Then Rowe thought about the 6 weeks the Council had spent on the Kale 5 medical request, about the amber vote counter, about a human ambassador who had simply stood up one morning and walked out without saying a word. Rowe opened a personal log for the first time in 12 years of service. I am beginning to understand, Rowe wrote slowly, what it looks like when something has been patient for a very long time. The departure requests kept coming. Rowe stamped each one. They were all filled out correctly. They always had been. I found out about the infrastructure report on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen of the house in Edinburgh that had been my grandmother's, standing by the window with a cup of tea that was getting cold because I had forgotten to drink it. The garden outside was doing what Scottish gardens do in early spring. Not quite green yet, not quite gray. Something in between that felt very honest. I had been back on Earth for 2 months, and I still was not used to how big the sky looked. My communicator was on the table. I had set it to silent for most of the day now, which would have been unimaginable a year ago. For 11 years, it had been the most important object I owned. Now I mostly ignored it until I did not. The message from Director Hartley came in at 0847. It was longer than his usual ones, and had an attachment, a 40-page document with the Council's internal audit flag in the header. He had added only 1 line of personal text above it. Thought you should see this, he wrote. Read carefully from page 18 onward. I read the whole thing. I will tell you what the Council found when they finally sat down and looked at what human involvement had actually meant to the conclave of Urasath. Not what they had assumed it meant. Not what they had been willing to officially acknowledge it meant, what it actually, measurably, provably meant. 34% of the conclave's total infrastructure maintenance had been managed, directly or through automated systems built by human teams, by human personnel. This included atmospheric processors, water systems, power distribution across the lower and mid-level residential tiers, waste management in 4 wings, and the entire network of secondary communication relays that served the outer docking rings. 61% of the xenobiological medical staff working in the conclave's shared health facilities were human or had been trained by human institutions. The health facilities served 38 of the 41 council species. The 3 they did not serve were the Vel Tarathi, the Dominari, and the Shari, who each maintained their own private medical operations and had never used the shared facilities. The translation layer serving 17 species had gone dark on a Thursday afternoon, when the cached matrix finally reached the end of its last update cycle. Those 17 species could still communicate internally. They could not communicate outward, not to the council, not to each other across species lines, not through any channel that did not route through a system that 3 human linguists had maintained and nobody had known to worry about. 6 of those 17 species were the smallest, youngest members of the council. 3 of them had no independent diplomatic history predating their council membership. They had learned how to function within the galactic political system through their relationship with human advisors who had sat with them, walked them through procedures, helped them file proposals, and, in at least 2 cases, written the initial frameworks for their council representation structure. Those 6 species were now effectively without a voice. I read all of that in the morning kitchen with the tea going cold and the garden doing its honest thing outside, and I felt a feeling that I had not expected. I had expected satisfaction, perhaps. I had been angry for a long time, and sometimes anger curdles into something that feels like satisfaction when it is finally proven right. I had expected that. What I felt instead was something quieter, something that took me a while to name. It was grief. Not for what had happened to the council, not for the procedural chaos that was now apparently consuming 3 steering committee sessions per week, as they tried to figure out how to patch systems that nobody had learned how to maintain because it had simply always been done. Not grief for the inconvenience of the great and powerful bodies that had spent 40 years treating human membership as an administrative courtesy. Grief for the 6 small species who were sitting in silence in their gallery seats, unable to speak, whose only real advocates in that enormous room had packed up and left with everyone else. I had not thought about them when we left. I need to say that clearly. I had been thinking about Kale 5, and about my grandmother, and about amber vote counters, and about a grief so deep it had finally turned into exhaustion. I had not thought about the Kethanari, a species of about 60 million people who had been council members for 12 years, and whose entire diplomatic vocabulary had been shaped by human guidance. I had not thought about the Orath delegation, who had first made contact with the broader galaxy through a human exploration vessel, and who trusted human judgment almost completely, because that was the only galactic judgment they had ever been given time to learn. It was not a comfortable morning in that kitchen. Ambassador Velthoth gave a speech on the floor of the council chamber 2 days later. The feed reached me on a delay because I was no longer flagged as active diplomatic personnel, and my access tier had been downgraded. I watched it on a public relay with about a 3-hour lag. Velthoth was a careful speaker. He chose his words with the deliberateness of a species that had been in space for 4,000 years and had learned that careless words had very long consequences. He was not a cruel being. He had simply never considered humanity a serious actor. In his speech, he called our departure an act of willful disruption. He said that any member species, regardless of tier, had a responsibility to the functioning of the council, and that withdrawing without notice, and without transition planning, was a failure of that responsibility. I watched this 3 hours late with my cold tea. I want to be precise about what I felt during that speech. I did not feel anger. I think I had gone past where anger lived. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a pattern so deep and so old that it had become almost comfortable in the way that a bad habit is comfortable, not because it feels good, but because it is familiar. The council had spent 6 weeks doing nothing, while Kale 5 lost 45,000 people to a treatable illness, and the explanation for that was procedure. Now the council was losing the ability to talk to 17 of its members, and the explanation for that was human irresponsibility. Procedure when the cost was ours, responsibility when the cost was theirs. I turned off the feed before the speech finished. What I did instead was send a message to the 6 junior species through a personal relay contact I had kept from my time on the conclave, not an official channel. Just a quiet, private message, in each species' primary language, telling them that the translation layer could be restored if someone requested the source files, that those files were stored in an open archive on a human-operated relay station and were freely available to any licensed engineer, and that I knew 3 independent communications firms who could have the system running again within weeks. I did not make it an offer from Earth's government. I made it an offer from me, personally, because I had sat in that room for 11 years, and I knew what it felt like to not be able to speak, and I was not willing to let that be someone else's experience if I could help it. 2 of the 6 species responded within a day. The Kethanari message was short and formal. The Orath message was longer and included, at the end, a phrase in their language that did not translate directly, but which my dictionary rendered approximately as, "We did not know you were the door, and we did not know the door had been there all along." I read that phrase several times. Director Hartley called that evening. He was in Geneva, and the light behind him had that flat northern quality that made everything look slightly important. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was doing something that felt like fine but was probably more complicated than that. He nodded as if that was exactly the right answer. He told me that the council had formally voted to request humanity's return. It had passed by a margin of 26-9, with the Vel-Tarathi and Dominari both voting in favor for the first time in their recorded history of ever voting in favor of anything involving humanity directly. The request had been filed correctly, he said. It had gone to our automated relay service. The relay had sent back an acknowledgement and a promise to respond within standard processing cycles. He was not smiling when he told me this, but there was something in his eyes that was not quite not smiling either. What I felt, hearing that, was not triumph. I want to be clear about this too. It did not feel good in the way that winning is supposed to feel good. It felt like the moment after a very long, very loud noise finally stops. Not peace, not victory, just the strange new weight of quiet. We had been so busy trying to earn a seat at their table that we had not noticed we had been holding the table up. I thought about that for a long time. The vessel that arrived at Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning was not a council ship. That was the first thing they told us when the approach request came through. And they were careful about it. The captain of the vessel, a standard Vel-Tarathi long-range courier, stated clearly in the opening channel that the mission was not authorized by the Galactic Council, that no steering member ambassador was on board, and that the single occupant requesting surface contact was traveling in a personal capacity. The name on the passenger manifest was Ro, Logistics Officer, 3rd rank, Conclave of Urasath Docking Authority. I almost did not take the meeting. The Earth Liaison Office forwarded the request to me because, technically, I was still listed as the senior human ambassador to the Galactic Council in the active personnel records, even though I had not held that role in 6 months. The file was clean. The request was polite. The stated purpose of the visit was listed as a personal exchange of information and contained no official seals from any council body. It had been filed correctly, with all the appropriate forms completed in full. I recognized that particular quality of paperwork. I had produced enough of it myself over the years. I took the meeting. Ro arrived at the liaison building in Nairobi on a Wednesday afternoon. I had chosen Nairobi because it was not Geneva, which would have made the meeting feel more official than it was, and not Edinburgh, which felt too personal. Nairobi was a middle ground, a city that had been the center of Earth's own diplomatic history in the old era, before the stars had opened up, and it had a particular quality of light in the afternoon that made everything feel slightly more real than it might otherwise. The conference room I had booked was small, a round table, 6 chairs, a window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted a line of fever trees that had been there for over 100 years. I brought a flask of coffee because nobody had told me what Vel-Tarathi preferred, and I needed something to do with my hands. Ro was taller than I expected. Vel-Tarathi were tall as a rule, But Ro was quiet in the way of a person who has spent a long time in small spaces doing careful work. And that quietness made the height seem less significant. Ro stood in the doorway of the conference room for a moment, looking at the round table, and then sat down in the chair across from me, without any ceremony. I poured coffee. I did not drink. Ro did not ask for anything. For a moment, we both just existed in the same room. It was the first time since leaving the conclave that I had been in a closed space, with a member of another species, and it felt strange in a way I had not anticipated. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like a muscle that had rested for a long time suddenly being asked to do its job again. Ro spoke first. The translation device Ro carried was small and fast, and the voice it produced was flat and careful, which matched the way Ro seemed to think. "I am not here with an offer," Ro said. "I want to make that clear before we begin. I am not authorized to offer anything on behalf of the council." I told Ro I had assumed as much. "Then why are you here?" I said. Ro looked at me for a moment, not with the distant, measuring look that Veltarathi ambassadors tended to use, the one that made you feel like a problem being assessed. This was a different look, something Ro had not entirely worked out yet. "Because I processed 417 departure manifests," Ro said, "and I want to understand what they meant." I told Ro what they meant. I took my time about it. I did not use diplomatic language. I did not use the careful, qualified vocabulary I had spent 11 years developing for use in Gallery 7. I used plain words, the same kind my grandmother would have used over tea. And I told Ro about the amber vote counter, and the 6 weeks, and the number on my screen that went down instead of up. And I told Ro about the day the message from Director Hartley came, and about walking out of a room that had not looked up from its catering discussion. Ro listened without interrupting. Veltarathi were very good at listening. They simply had not always been listening to humans before. When I finished, Ro was quiet for a moment. Then Ro asked if I could show the departure that had started all of it, not the council's departure request, then the event that had made the decision inevitable. I understood what Ro was asking for. I pulled up the KL5 file on my communicator and turned it around on the table so Ro could see the screen. I did not say anything. I just let Ro look at it. The file contained the delay timeline, week by week, procedure by procedure, and the number that had gone from 212,000 to 167,000 in the time it took the council to gather 3 signatures. Ro looked at the screen for a long time. I watched Ro's face while this happened. Veltarathi faces were not easy to read, not for humans. The expressions were different, smaller, happening in parts of the face that human instinct did not automatically check. But something moved in Ro's features while looking at that file, something slow and deep, the way weather moves through a large body of water. Ro looked up from the screen. "We did not know," Ro said. I told Ro that that was precisely the problem. Ro sat with that. Then Ro told me about the 6 minor species, not because I did not already know, but because Ro had been the one watching from the docking authority when the Evening Ridge departed with the last of the translation linguists. And Ro had understood before the council did what that would mean. Ro had written a report. The report had been received, logged, and tagged with a procedural reference number. Ro said this without apparent irony, but with the exact weight that made irony unnecessary. I told Ro I had sent personal messages to 2 of the 6 species. I told Ro the Orath phrase that had come back to me, the one about the door. Ro was quiet for a long time after that. Then Ro said, "I came expecting you to name a price." I told Ro we did not leave to win a negotiation. Ro seemed to find this difficult to process, not in a negative way, so just difficult, like a piece of information that did not fit the existing shape of the world, and was therefore asking the world to change shape, which takes time. "Then why," Ro said slowly, "did you leave at all?" I picked up my coffee cup and then put it back down without drinking from it. "Because," I said, "we were tired." I did not say it with anger. I did not say it with bitterness. I said it the way you say something that is simply true, the way you say the sky is dark or the tea is cold, just a fact about the nature of a thing. Ro looked out the window at the fever trees in the courtyard. They were old trees, their trunks pale and their canopies thin but wide, full of that particular kind of persistence that old trees in difficult climates develop. I think, Ro said after a long time, that I have been watching from a small office for 12 years without understanding what I was watching. I told Ro that was more than most people managed. What happens now? Ro asked. I told Ro that was genuinely not a question I was able to answer alone, not because I did not have thoughts about it, but because the decision did not belong to me, any more than the original withdrawal had belonged only to me. There were 200 million humans, and a parliament of worlds, and a director in Geneva, who all had a part in that conversation. But I can tell you, I said, what will not happen. We will not go back to being a probationary observer. We will not return to Gallery 7 and amber vote counters and 6 weeks of procedure while people die. Whatever comes next, those things are not part of it. Ro nodded slowly. Then Ro said something I had not expected. Ro said, the 6 small species, the ones who cannot speak right now, they asked me to come. Not the council. The council voted against sending anyone at all, because they were afraid it would set a precedent. It was 3 of the 6 who pooled their resources to charter this vessel and file the approach request. I am here because they asked me to come, because in 12 years on the docking floor, I had spoken to enough human technicians to seem, I suppose, like a safer choice than an official envoy. I looked at Ro for a moment. Then I said, what did they ask you to ask? Ro said, they asked me to ask if you would come back for them, even if not for the council. That sat in the room for a while. Outside, the fever trees moved a little in the afternoon wind. I told Ro I needed time to think about that. I told Ro I would send an answer within 2 weeks. Ro said that was acceptable. We sat for a while longer without saying much else. At some point, I did drink my coffee. It had gone cold, which felt appropriate. Ro looked out at the courtyard, and I looked at the fever trees. And we were 2 people from 2 different worlds, sitting in a small room in Nairobi, on a Wednesday afternoon, with a very large question, somewhere on the table between us. When Ro finally stood to leave, I walked Ro to the building entrance. At the door, Ro paused and turned back. I wrote a personal log, Ro said, on the night I finished reviewing the infrastructure records, the night I finally understood what was happening. I asked what it said. Ro thought for a moment. I wrote that I was beginning to understand what it looks like when something has been patient for a very long time. Ro paused. I understand now that I was wrong. I asked in what way. It was not patience, Ro said. It was endurance. The 2 things look the same from a distance. They are not the same. Ro left. I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the city. Nairobi was noisy in the late afternoon, full of the kind of sound that living cities make when they are fully themselves. Above it, if you knew where to look, you could see the faint pale line of one of Earth's orbital stations crossing the early evening sky. Endurance, not patience. I thought Ro was right. I went back inside and wrote a very long message to Director Hartley. The Meridian station had no dome. This was one of the first things people noticed when they arrived, because every major diplomatic station in known space had a dome of some kind. The conclave of Urasath had its translucent alloy dome with the view of the moons. The Vel-Tarathi's ancient forum had its great curved ceiling of polished stone. The Dominari Congress had a dome that simulated the sky of their homeworld at all times, a deep amber color that visitors from other species sometimes found unsettling. The Meridian station had windows, just windows, all the way around the outer ring of the main chamber, and through them you could see everything. Not a curated view, not a filtered image, raw space, in every direction, stars and nebulae, and the distant smear of galaxies too far away to have names yet. You could sit at the round table in the center of the chamber, and look in any direction, and see the universe exactly as it was, unmediated, not framed by anything. This had been intentional. I had been part of the design committee, and the argument I had made was this. Every dome is a decision about what you want people to look at. Every ceiling is a choice about what matters. We were building something new, and I did not want it to be built around a choice someone else had already made. I wanted the people who sat at that table to be able to look at the actual sky, in all its actual directions, and remember that the things they were deciding mattered out there, not just in here. The architect, a quiet woman from New Zealand named Georgia Ash, had nodded and asked if we also wanted the windows rated for direct stellar radiation up to Class 4, because otherwise it would be impractical for species sensitive to certain light frequencies. I told her yes, and to make them as clear as possible anyway. She had done a good job. I arrived at the Meridian station for the first formal session of the Meridian Compact on a morning that was morning only by the station's internal clock, which ran on a 24-hour cycle set to Nairobi Mean Time, for no politically significant reason, except that Nairobi had been where the conversation with Roe happened, and Director Hartley had said that all starts needed an anchor. 9 species were seated at the round table. Not 9 species sending observers. 9 species who had signed the Compact Charter and were present as full, equal members with the same voice, the same vote weight, and the same right to speak without being placed on a waiting list, pending steering member approval. Among them were the Kethanari and the Orath. The Orath delegate, a being called Nav Sol, who communicated through a combination of sound and pressure waves that the new translation layer handled without any difficulty, arrived before any of the others, and spent a long time standing at the windows, looking out. I found Navsol there when I came in, and stood beside them for a moment without speaking. Navsol made a sound that the translator rendered approximately as, "This is the right kind of room." I agreed that it was. The Velterathi were not at the table. They had not signed the compact. They had not formally acknowledged its existence, which was a Velterathi way of taking a position without having to defend it publicly. Roe was there, but in an observer capacity, seated in a chair, along the outer ring of the room with several other unofficial attendees. Roe had accepted the observer invitation the day it was extended, and had asked no questions about the agenda. The Dominari had sent a delegation. This had been the most complicated part of the preceding months. The Dominari delegation was 3 people, none of them ambassadors, all of them from the Dominari Institute for Cross-Species Relations, which was a research body rather than a political one. They were there under an observer status, similar to Roe's, which meant they could watch and listen, but could not vote or formally participate in proceedings. They had agreed to these terms in writing, which was the first time in recorded history that a Dominari body had agreed to an inferior status in any room without extensive conditions attached. I did not celebrate this out loud. It was not by itself enough. It was a beginning, and beginnings were not the same as conclusions, but I noted it. The first session of the Meridian Compact lasted 4 hours. In those 4 hours, 3 items of business were completed. The first was the formal ratification of the Compact's founding charter, which every seated delegate had already reviewed and approved individually, but which needed to be affirmed collectively in session. It passed without objection. The vote counter on the screen above the round table, which we had built ourselves and which had no amber setting, showed 9 in favor, 0 against. I looked at those numbers for a moment longer than was strictly professional. The second item was the Kethanari medical request. The Kethanari had a colony on a moon called Velshara that was dealing with a soil contamination issue affecting their agricultural systems. They needed access to Dominari soil remediation technology, which the Dominari held in their scientific archive. The Kethanari had been trying to request this for 7 months through council channels without success. The Kethanari delegate, a being named Oshvel, presented the request. It took 12 minutes. The compact had a rule. Medical and environmental emergency requests received immediate first session consideration, within 24 hours of submission, with a mandatory response window of 72 hours. The Dominari observer delegation made a note. They could not vote. They did not have that right in this room. But when the compact formally documented the request and sent it to the Dominari Institute for forwarding to the appropriate archive authorities, the lead observer, a Dominari academic named Vel Karoth, leaned over to his colleague and said something in their language. The translator in my earpiece rendered it quietly. Vel Karoth said, "We should have done this ourselves, a long time ago." The third item of business was the naming of the station's primary chamber. This had been an open question during the construction and design phase. Director Hartley had suggested something historical. Georgia Ash had suggested something geographical. Several of the founding species had submitted names in their own languages. A vote had been held. The result had been communicated to me the week before the session. The chamber would be called the Kale 5 Room. Not as a wound, Not as an accusation, but as a reminder, because the thing that had cracked the old structure open had been a number on a small screen going down instead of up, and the people in that number deserved to be the reason that something better existed. The colony on KL-5 had eventually received the Dominari treatment, through back channels arranged by the 6 minor species once they regained their voice through the restored translation layer. It had been 4 months after the outbreak began. Some of the losses could not be recovered, but most of the people who had been there when I walked out of Gallery 7 were still alive. I had thought about naming the chamber for my grandmother. Her name was Helen Miles, and she had cried in 2089 when humanity joined the council, and believed that everything would change. I had thought about it, and then decided that she would not have wanted a room named after her. She had been a practical woman, and she would have said, probably over tea, that the room being useful was enough. I think she was right. She usually was. After the session, when the delegates were moving around the chamber, talking to each other in the free way that people talk when they are not performing at a podium, I found myself at one of the windows. Space outside, in all its directions. Far to the left of the station, if you knew where to look, you could just barely see the faint light ring of the conclave of Urasath. It had always been one of the most beautiful things in this part of the galaxy. It still was. Distance had not changed that. Ro came and stood beside me. We had spoken several times since the Nairobi meeting. Ro had become, through some process neither of us had formally defined, something like a correspondent. Not a friend exactly. Something more careful and more useful than that. Someone who watched from a particular vantage point and reported honestly. Ro looked at the distant light of the old station. They are struggling, Ro said. Not collapse, not yet, but the audit results are becoming public, and there is pressure from 20 member species that the Council cannot account for. Some of them are threatening to petition for compact observer status. I asked Ro how the Vel Tarathi elders were taking that. Ro paused. Slowly, Ro said, in the way that we take things that require us to change what we believe about how things work. It is not a fast process for us. I told Ro there was no deadline. Ro looked at me, then Ro looked back at the light of the old station. We made a mistake with you, Ro said. I do not mean procedurally, I mean fundamentally. We made a mistake about what you were. I asked what they had thought we were. Ro considered this. Smaller, Ro said finally. We thought you were smaller than you are. Not in size, not in numbers, in weight, in the weight of what you meant to the structure that held us all. I thought about that. I thought about my grandmother in Edinburgh, and the year the council said yes, and what it had cost her generation to believe that yes was real. I thought about the amber vote counter, and the 6 weeks, and the 45,000, and the way a number goes down when it should be going up. I thought about walking out of a room that was debating catering while people were dying, and I thought about Georgia Ash making the windows as clear as possible so that the people at this table could always see the actual sky. I did not say any of this to Ro. Some things do not need to be spoken to be heard. Someone across the room called my name. Nav-Saul wanted to discuss the agenda for the next session. The Orath always prepared thoroughly and early, and I had found this quality deeply, genuinely admirable. I told Ro I would be back. I walked back toward the round table where 9 species were talking and planning and occasionally disagreeing in the productive way. That means people are actually thinking. And I sat down in my chair, which was the same size and height as every other chair at the table, and I looked at the vote counter above the table that had no amber setting. Someone had once called our departure cowardice. I had read that speech 3 hours late on a public relay, and I had thought about it many times since. I thought about it now. There is a thing that people sometimes confuse for cowardice, which is the decision to stop carrying something that was never yours to carry, to stop holding up a structure that had been quietly resting its full weight on you for 40 years, without acknowledgement, or thanks, or even awareness, to put that weight down, carefully, so that it lands without destroying everything underneath it, and to walk away not because you have given up, but because you finally understood that the only way to build something better is to stop pretending that what already exists can be fixed from inside a gallery seat that nobody ever asked you to actually use. We had not given up. We had stopped pretending. And in the space that opened when we stopped pretending, we had built a room with clear windows and a round table, and a vote counter, with no amber setting, and a rule that said no one would wait more than 72 hours when something urgent needed to be decided. We had built it for 9 species, and the door was open to more. We had built it because of KL5, and because of my grandmother, and because of a Veltarathi logistics officer, who had processed 417 departure forms and finally understood the difference between patience and endurance. We had built it, most of all, because there were 17 small species who had once had no voice, and who now sat at a table where every voice carried the same weight. That was the answer to the question of why we left. That was what the amber vote counter had been building toward, for 40 years, without knowing it. Nav Sol was waiting, and the agenda for the next session was long, and outside the clear windows of the KL5 room, the stars were exactly as they had always been, and we had a great deal of work to do. I picked up my tablet and I got started.